Thank you so much, Colleen. I want to say, since she mentioned Schools, Inc., I found it terribly ironic that PBS would be putting on a 3-hour documentary funded by people who want to get rid of PBS. But that just goes to show what money can do for you. They've made the money pitch, so I won't, but I do want to I'm going to introduce the keynote speaker, but I want to tell a couple of stories. Charles Johnson, who spoke so eloquently before, inspired me to tell this story. I'm Jewish, and I went to High Holy Day services a few weeks ago at the Gay Synagogue in New York City, which is the largest gay synagogue in the world. And the rabbi, Sharon Kleinbaum, this wonderful little woman, told the story about how they wanted to show witness at a time when immigrants and Muslims in particular were under attack. And so every Friday afternoon, members of the congregation go down to the NYU Muslim Center at NYU, and they hold a banner saying, Congregation CBST and the Jews of New York City support our Muslim neighbors. They do this every Friday afternoon. Consequently, at High Holy Day services, all of the ushers were Muslims. That's the America we all believe in. That's not the America we have. I also wanted to mention, in introducing Nicole Hannah-Jones, that I saw yesterday on Twitter that the German soccer team took a knee. Yes. So we're thrilled to have Nicole Hannah-Jones with us today. She's an award-winning investigative journalist reporting on racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. I was recently asked to do an article about the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, which was about the two Americas of 1968. And I found her research absolutely invaluable. She had done a piece for ProPublica, which I came across quite by accident, showing that there were many, many southern districts that were still under desegregation orders and had forgotten that they are. They didn't even know that they were still under desegregation orders. It was an amazing piece of research. I won't go into all of her many, many plaudits other than to say that just last week she was awarded one of the 24 MacArthur Genius Awards. She is a powerful writer, a brilliant researcher, and we're thrilled to have her with us. Please welcome Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Good afternoon. The other day someone said, "You're probably tired of being called a genius already." I was like, not yet. I'll get there, but not yet. All right. And we're already, right? So we tested this. I'm a writer, I'm not like a IT person. Is there someone who can help us get this going? There we go. All right. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank Ann and Carol for inviting me. I've read their research and their work in my own work, and they are doing very important work, and I know that this is a very important conference because I myself am the product of public schools. And clearly always had an affinity for big hair. So I grew up a product of the Waterloo Public Schools in Waterloo, Iowa. My daughter, was somebody from Iowa here? My daughter is a public school student. My husband was a public school student, and we believe strongly in public schools. I remember, you can clap for that. That's all right. As many of you know, as many of you are educators and public school advocates, you understand that teachers make such a profound difference in the lives of kids. I remember as a child, Mrs. Blau, who was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman who was one of the first teachers who really made me believe that I was smart. She nurtured my love of reading. She helped me understand that I was a good writer. And I just remember I was bused into white school starting in the 2nd grade. I was not only one of a handful of black kids in that school, but I was a handful of working class kids in that school. And so it was intimidating. And I automatically assumed that the other kids were smarter and better than me. And Mrs. Blau was one of the first people who helped me understand that they weren't, and that I was just as good as the other kids in class. It was another public school teacher, Mr. Ray Dial, who was my first and only black male teacher that I ever had in high school, who encouraged me to become a journalist. I was taking a Black Studies class with him, and I went to his class one day and I complained that our high school never wrote about kids like me. He told me, if you don't like it, either join the newspaper or don't ever come in my classroom and complain about it again. So that's what I did. He encouraged me to do that. I joined the paper. I won my very first journalism award from the Iowa High School Press Association, and I was hooked at that point because I understood the power of being able to tell our own stories and not allowing other people to write about your communities in a way that you felt was inaccurate. So public schools, I know, are invaluable, and teachers can change the trajectory of students' lives. But if anybody knows me, you know I didn't come here to give you guys a rosy speech, because that's not what I do. I think it's important to start from the beginning, and I know that this is a big part of this weekend, is that understanding that education in a democracy is critical, and that the father of public schools, father of public education, believed that education beyond all other devices of human origin is the greatest equalizer of the conditions of men. Well, that was clearly an aspirational thing that he said. Because what we also know is that Horace Mann was willing to sacrifice black children for his dream of starting common schools in this country. So from the founding of common schools, we understood that education would be the great equalizer for some men and women and not for others. And we have been dealing with that decision ever since then. And I'm here to talk to you about what we have wrought by our decision early on to decide, in order to get this dream of common schools, we were willing to sacrifice the opportunity and the ability for certain Americans to become full citizens. The black children were excluded from those common schools, and they were excluded from public education all across this country. As you know, Horace Mann started common schools in Massachusetts. So this was not a Southern phenomenon. This was not a phenomenon of racist conservatives. This was a national phenomenon. So I would like to say that there have always been two philosophies of education in this country, one for democracy and one for oppression. And I would posit that today we still have two philosophies of education. Because if you followed my work, you know I spend my time in the classrooms of schools where children are being educated for oppression and not for freedom. Where children are being educated in a way that teaches them that they are not full citizens in this country, and we will not prepare them to take full part in our democracy. And we're either going to choose to undo that or we're not. But I would say that our public schools, our public system of education is imperiled as long as we maintain these two systems. These two systems legally were mandated until 1954, when the Supreme Court, in what's considered its greatest ruling of the 20th century, and I would say one of its greatest rulings in the history of the court, strikes down separate and equal schools as unconstitutional. And the way it's commonly told is that in 1954, when the Supreme Court makes that ruling, we all suddenly realize the error of our ways. We sing Kumbaya, and we go on into an integrated future together. But that's clearly not what happened. We had believed in separate and unequal education from the founding of common schools in this country, and after 1954, we did not undo that. In fact, we launched into what was considered an era of massive resistance in the South and massive resistance in the North, because the North largely believed that Brown v. Board did not have anything to do with them. Because the North largely accomplished segregation through housing and policy and, oh, damn. Somebody doesn't like my speech. So we had this period of massive resistance, and it takes, by 1964, 10 years after Brown, as the slide shows, only 1% of black students in the South were attending an integrated school, or I would say desegregated school. So 99% of black children, 10 years after Brown, it looks as if Brown v. Board never happened. And then something kind of remarkable happens. In 1968, 14 years after Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court finally decides it has had enough. And it is going to force school districts to actually desegregate in a ruling out of Virginia, where it says it's not enough to simply remove laws that force segregation. You actually have to desegregate schools. You have to desegregate schools down to the teachers, the cafeteria workers, and the janitors. And the court said it wanted to look across schools and see not black schools or white schools, but simply schools. At the same time, you have a Congress that is willing to enforce laws, and you have a president that's willing to enforce laws. And so for this brief period, we finally start to see desegregation happening. And it happens very rapidly once we tried. Once all three branches of the federal government decide that desegregation is the law of the land and this is the right thing to do, you see desegregation in the South fall very rapidly. And by the 1970s, just 6 years later, 90% of black children in the South are now attending desegregated schools. So that myth about we tried and just couldn't do it is actually not true. We didn't try for very long. And when we tried, it actually worked. 1988, so let's do the math. 1954, Brown v. Board. 1968 is when we finally start to see real desegregation happening. And by 1988, we have decided that we're going to reverse course. 1988 is the year when school desegregation peaks in the United States. So 20 years, one generation of real desegregation. After decades and decades and decades of forced segregation, we decide that it's time to retreat from that. And this shows the percentage of black children in majority white schools, starting at the time of Brown until the current time. And you'll see that peaked in 1988, and since then, we've seen a resegregation. We've seen black children being less likely to be in integrated and desegregated schools. And we've reached now a point that we haven't seen since the 1970s. What's the problem with that? Because I think when I first started covering education in 2003, it was my very first job out of college. And I was writing about education in Durham, North Carolina, which was a majority black, very segregated school district in the South. And it was right at the time when we were starting to see the penalties of No Child Left Behind being kicked in. I don't know anything about education at that point, but what I knew is I would go into those schools where every single kid was black and every single kid was poor and see the farce of it all, that somehow if we tested those kids to death, they were going to somehow achieve the same thing as a school where every kid was rich and where every teacher was certified and where every kid had access to high quality curriculum. And that's when I wondered, what are we doing? And why are we not talking about this one thing that actually seems to have worked for children? So if you look at this graphic up here, these are standardized test scores. And you see where the gap is the narrowest between black children and white children. So the top line are white children's test scores, the bottom line are black children's test scores. And it's in 1988 at the peak of desegregation where that gap gets the narrowest. And as we've resegregated schools, we've never gotten back to that narrow of a gap. What's also amazing about this chart is you see that in less than 2 decades, with desegregation, we were able to cut the achievement gap in half. So imagine had we kept going. Imagine that generation of black children who were deprived of the quality education because we simply decided it wasn't worth it. The stark truth in this country is that even though Black Americans make up only 13% of the population of this country, there's never been a time where the majority or even half of Black kids have attended majority white schools. Now do the math. I'm a journalist. I'm not great at math. But I can tell you that's a hard thing to accomplish with such a small racial minority, that you can keep such a small number out of majority white schools in a country that has been 70 to 80% white. That only happens because you want it to be that way. How many of you guys have ever read the Brown v. Board of Education ruling? The whole ruling? Okay. That's usually about what I get when I come and I give a talk. And don't be embarrassed, because I didn't read the Brown v. Board of Education ruling when I started writing about school segregation. Most people think that the Brown v. Board of Education ruling was about unequal resources. And because we believe that, we somehow believe that today, separate and unequal is okay, because we have not mandated it by law. And that all we're required to do is give those Black and brown schools the same resources as white schools, and we will have done our job. But if you've read the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, you understand that they never mention test scores, and the ruling doesn't mention resources. What it mentions is citizenship. What it says is that when you have a country built on racial caste, and you separate the children who are part of the bottom of the caste in the society, you separate them from their full citizenship, that you separate them from their place in a democracy. And so because of that, you cannot make separate equal. You cannot make segregated schools equal. It is impossible, even if they have the same teachers, same textbooks, same curriculum. But we're much more comfortable thinking that we don't have to do anything about segregation. All we have to do is fix the inequality. The problem with that is we haven't done that either. We actually don't know if separate could be made equal, because we've never seen it for a single day in this country. The picture on the left, 1953. Picture on the right, 2014. Why is the picture on the left wrong and the picture on the right is okay? Why have we come to accept that when we won't accept that what we did in 1953 was okay? Picture on the left is in the Bronx, New York. Picture on the right is Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is a national problem, it's a national scourge, and in fact, the South is the most integrated part of the country for Black students and the most integrated part of the country for neighborhoods, because the South was forced to integrate because of court orders, and the North largely avoided that at all. So if you want to find your most segregated school systems, California is the most segregated state for Latino students. New York is the most segregated state for Black students. One of the big problems with my work, and that's why I wrote the story about trying to find a school for my daughter in New York last year, is all of the progressive white people, after I write about the South, who come and tell me, I can't believe they're so backwards down there. My response is always, have you seen Chicago? Have you seen New York? Have you seen Philadelphia? Should I go down the list? Los Angeles Unified, San Francisco, we can go down the list. The truth is, and all of you know it, if you're educators, you know it because you've seen it. Separate is no more equal today than it was in 1954. We can predict the resources in a school based on the color of the kids in that building. We know that Black and brown kids are the least likely to have a certified teacher, an experienced teacher. They get the least access to advanced placement and honors level courses. They get the least access to rigorous curriculum. They're funded at least, and they have the highest dropout rates. They also have the highest rates of having to take remedial courses if they happen to make it to college. We have set them up. And we somehow want to ignore this is data. And you can get the data from the U.S. Department of Education. They collect it every year. And in fact, under the Obama administration, the U.S. Department of Education said that the disparities are so stark they may very well be constitutional. Now, you have to ask them why they then didn't go around suing all of these school districts where they said they may be unconstitutional, but unfortunately, that's the times that we live in. You can get this math, and it is disturbing. If any of you heard the piece I did for the radio on Michael Brown's school district in Normandy, Missouri, called The Problem We All Live With, the first thing I knew when I found out, when his mother was standing outside with his son's body laying on the ground behind the yellow police tape. And she was talking about, do you know how hard it was to get a black boy to graduate? How many of you are parents in here? If your child died, at that moment with your child laying on the ground behind you, would you be talking about schools? What does that tell you about the struggle for a black parent to get something that most of us take for granted? And when I heard her say that, I'd already been covering school segregation exclusively for a couple of years. I knew that I could spend 2 minutes on Google and I could find that his school was exactly like I thought it was. I knew he went to a segregated school. I knew he went to a school where every kid was poor. I knew he went to a failing school. And I'm not one who believes that every school with low test scores is a failing school, but I knew that he went to a failing school. And it took 2 minutes, and it was confirmed. Not only was he in a high poverty, segregated, failing school, his entire district was the most segregated, the poorest, and the worst district in the state of Missouri. Out of 512 school systems in the state, his school district was ranked at the very bottom. So every year, thousands of kids were cycling through this school system that we all knew was not educating these students. And these graphics up here, which some of you it may be kind of hard to see, it basically showing the disparities between Michael Brown School District and a neighboring white school district. And it also showed the disparity between students of different races. So the blue columns, the dark blue columns on the left, are the white students in the white school district. The light blue columns are the test scores of the black students in the white school district. And then the green columns are the test scores of the black students in Normandy. So no, there's still an achievement gap in the white school district, but it should be unconscionable that you would have black children who are scoring this low on test scores, because what that tells you, it's not about race. If these kids can do that much better just in a neighboring district, it's about how we're educating those kids. And then if you look at the graphic on the right, it's not surprising. It's not surprising that the four-year graduation rate for black students at the white school district was 94% and only 61% at Normandy. When teachers made more, the average teacher's salary in the white district was a lot higher. The average per pupil spending was higher. But the most important thing, the percentage of high school core classes not taught by highly qualified teachers in the white district was 1%. In Michael Brown's district, it was 40%. And in fact, many of the teachers were just long-term subs who weren't teaching in any subject that they'd ever been trained in to teach. This is common. This is common all across the country. And so, as we're talking about our fears of the privatization movement today, I think we need to be very honest. The inequality we have allowed in our public schools has opened the door for the choice and privatization movement. You look at the places where vouchers, and you look at the places where charter schools flourish, they're in places where parents are desperate, where Black and Latino parents have a choice of either a public school where their kids are likely not going to get a good education, or a charter school where maybe their kids still won't get a good education, but at least they feel like they have a choice. At least they feel like they have an option. As long as we are willing to sustain this level of inequality in public schools, you are going to provide fuel for the privatization movement. And the argument that parents should not enroll, that a poor Black or brown parent should not enroll their child in a charter school who is sending them a glossy flyer, who invites them in, who promises these results, that somehow because of the morality of the common good of a public school that they will not make that choice, it's ludicrous. Parents want to just go, and particularly Black parents, because there's a long history with Black parents of understanding that common schools were a necessity for the uplift of the entire community. Black parents don't tend to make their educational choices just based on what they want for their individual child. And so very easily, if you were providing a quality education, this would not be the first choice of these parents. But we have sustained an unequal system that allows this movement to thrive. I know this, of course, firsthand, because not only have I written about school segregation for years, a couple years ago, I found myself with my own child having to make a decision, where would I send her to school in the most segregated large school system in the country, which is New York City. The disparity between schools in New York is desperate, and it is depressing, and it'll make you cry. It has made me cry. And here I am, a parent with privilege, having to decide, am I going to be like every other parent of privilege I know, advocates I know, scholars who write about segregation I know, who then decide to enroll their own children in the schools that who decide not to enroll their own children in schools that they write about. But that's a terrible choice to ask a parent to make. And as long as we're sustaining this unequal system, most parents will not make the choice to put their child in a segregated high poverty school. Not if they can choose it. So we look at all across the country. I'm working on a book right now on school segregation, and the narrative of my book is Detroit. And it's Detroit for a few reasons. Detroit is considered the worst major school system in the country. Its test scores are abysmal. It has been ravaged by the charter school movement. Half of all the students in Detroit now go to charter schools. And if you've read anything about the charter schools there, a lot of reputable charter operators won't even go into Michigan or Detroit because there's basically no regulation. Schools open and close at the blink of an eye. Kids can't find their transcript. It's terrible, but parents are desperate. Detroit is the site of a 1974 landmark Supreme Court ruling where Supreme Court strikes down a metro-wide desegregation program that would force desegregation of the city of Detroit with its white suburbs. And the court decides, yes, the constitutional rights of black children have been violated, but we're not going to force these white suburbs to integrate with the children of the city, which of course in the north means you don't get integration because most of the cities in the north experience white flight, where white people left the cities and moved to the suburbs. And so there's no way to integrate school systems that don't have any black children left in them. And what we see in Detroit is the result of that flight and result of that Supreme Court ruling. But what some of you may not know is last year, a civil rights group based here in California filed a lawsuit against the state of Michigan for what they said the Detroit was denying the constitutional right of school children to literacy, of black children specifically to literacy. That the education that children were receiving in Detroit was so terrible that large numbers of the children cannot read. And I'm talking about high school children who are reading on a third grade level. Part of the lawsuit says the proficiency rates in the plaintiff schools hover near zero in all areas. On a percentile scale of 0 to 100, there are schools that have 1, 2, 4, and 6. These are public schools where children are literally receiving no education whatsoever. And I've been in the schools, and I can tell you, everyone's given up on these kids. And then we look at these kids and we say, those are the kids who don't value an education. What I'll say is, those are the kids who understand very clearly that we don't value their education. Because the truth is, yes, many of these kids come in with gaps. They walk into the school doors with gaps. And then we make excuses because they walk into the school doors with gaps. But what the research shows is that our schools actually harm them. The gaps that they walk in the doors with increase the longer that they're in a segregated school. And so instead of closing the gaps, these schools are exacerbating the gaps. And the gaps they come in with in kindergarten, by the time they get to high school, have almost doubled. They just fall further and further behind. Now, I'm a parent, and I can tell you, I travel a lot. I'm never in my daughter's school. The idea that is somehow upon the parents to educate children, I think we need to stop saying that. If you have my kid for 8 hours a day and you can't teach my child anything, what are you doing? And I'm not saying it's all on the parents, because clearly it's not. But what we know is when you put those same kids, because the research also shows, in a majority white or integrated schools, that test score gap declines. We know that. And we know the segregation only makes that gap worse. The kids aren't getting dumber through the years. So something is clearly happening. But much more important than that, we've become so hyper-focused on test scores as if those are the only thing that matters. My daughter's in a low test score school. She's doing great because the test scores aren't even reflecting what's being taught in that school. I would say focusing on test scores is a way that we can get away from having to do the real work. Because if we focus on test scores, we believe that if we can just get those kids' test scores up, we don't have to do anything about the fundamental inequality of segregated schools. That is what No Child Left Behind was based on. That is what Race to the Top is based on. It is a neoplesiism, which says we will no longer try to integrate these kids. We are just going to make their separate schools equal. And as I said, we have yet to do that for a single day. But worse than that, what the research shows is that segregation isn't just about test scores. It is, as the Supreme Court understood in 1954, about full citizenship in this country. That black students who had the ability to go to desegregated schools, it changed the entire trajectory of their lives. It didn't just help them score better on a test. It meant they were more likely to graduate high school and go on to college. They were less likely to be poor. They were less likely to serve time in jail and be incarcerated. They were less likely to live in segregated neighborhoods. They were healthier. They lived longer. And even within the same family, when you had one child who went to a desegregated school and one child who went to the integrated school, they still had very different results. So it wasn't just the family. It was the opportunity to get the same thing that white children get. That's what desegregation is about. There's nothing about sitting next to white folks are cool, but there's nothing about sitting next to white people that makes black kids smarter. It is unfortunately the only way in this country we've ever guaranteed that black children will get the same thing that white children get. So if we want full democracy, we have to have kids in the same classrooms together, not just the same buildings. So here's another harsh truth. We've been going towards privatization in public schools for a long time now. A lot of progressive public school advocates and parents and educators have embraced the concept and the language of the market. And so now we have conditioned parents to expect, you need to market to me. I should have a choice. I should be able to pick what program and what school I'm going to put my child in. The logical extension of that is, I shouldn't have to go to a public school at all. Just give me a voucher and let me pick wherever I want to go. That's the logical extension of what we have done as we have introduced market concepts into public schools. If we don't want to believe that every public school should look the same, that some will offer this special program in order to attract this elite group of parents, then this is what we have wrought. I wrote about this in a piece I did for the New York Times a couple months ago with Betsy DeVos when she was confirmed. There was that hashtag that went around Twitter, Public School Strong. And I thought that was amazing, but I thought people weren't actually being honest. That so many of these public school strong parents were parents who were advocating for choice that logically builds a two-tiered system and that leaves almost always Black and Latino parents behind and low-income parents behind. So by encouraging shopping for schools, that then leads to expansion of charters and private schools. By losing the moral language of a common good, instead talking about public education as an individual good, why can't I get every advantage for my child? That's not what public education is supposed to be about. And so we need to rethink this idea that we have allowed to grow, and now we can't contain it. If educators want to stop the privatization movement, you have to reclaim the moral message of public education. That public education is not about an individual good. That is a hard thing to say. I'm a parent. You want your child, of course, to have every advantage. But then you have to understand that advantage comes at the expense of someone else, or it's not an advantage. We've gotten away from saying that public schools are about all of us. They're about building a community. They're about building a common understanding of each other. They're about the sharing of resources. I mean, this is the most socialist of institutions, if you think about it. We all pay in and we all get the same thing, but now we want to talk about it as if it is a market institution. And what that does is it normalizes a two-tiered system, because we know that the market is built on the premise of haves and have-nots. That is, by definition, what capitalism is. The only way that I can get the best for my child is somebody else's child cannot get the best. And I know that that can feel unnatural as a parent to say, I'm not going to try to get every advantage. But what I will say is that those of us who have those advantages, we can give our child every other advantage. Do we have to take this one too? Because the difference for the poor child going into a school where school becomes so much more important, because that literally is the only thing that can lift that child out of his circumstance. My daughter will be okay no matter where she is.
That's right.
And so we have to ask ourselves, when I first started writing about school segregation 5 years ago, I set up a Google alert. And I would get pinged on the word school segregation, school integration, maybe once a month, once every 2 months. And I was so curious as to why this one thing that all the research was showing was the most powerful, scalable way to close the achievement gap. Something that didn't harm white children, that actually benefited white children as well, but could be transformative for Black and Latino children. That all of these good-hearted people who wanted to understand how do we fix this would not talk about the only thing that actually worked. That requires some soul searching. When I did my first big investigation, I spent a year doing investigation on school resegregation in the South as school districts were released from their federal court orders. And I would wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, because I'm like, I'm spending a year on something that no one's going to read and no one's going to care about, because we've decided we're not going to talk about school segregation. Luckily, that didn't happen. That's why I'm here talking to you guys today. Because for some reason, I don't know, you guys paid attention to it. I'm not sure why. I think it was because the conventional wisdom had been that we tried it and it didn't work. And my work has tried to reframe that narrative and say, actually, we didn't try for very long and it did work. And we can't give up on this thing, because there are millions of kids who are depending on us every day and we're failing them. So this is the fact. You can't save a public system built on inequality and segregation. If you want to save public schools, the fight must be centered around integration. It absolutely must, because that's what changes the narrative about our failing schools. The schools white children go to are not failing. Those schools are preparing those kids. Those kids are able to compete globally. But our country is no longer a nearly all-white country. And it's one thing when you're depriving 15% of your population of a quality education. It's another thing when you're depriving half. That's going to affect everyone. I mean, if nothing else, who the hell do you think is going to pay your Social Security when you get old, right? I mean. And the other thing is, we simply cannot say that we want equal educational opportunities for all children and fight to advantage our own. And this can be your own as in your own child, or it can be your own as in the children in your community, however you define your community. And I think one of the problems we're seeing is people are wanting to define their community in smaller and smaller ways. Like, sometimes really small. I mean, when I wrote about my daughter's school, which became embroiled in this integration battle, my daughter's school was all Black and Latino, nearly all poor, and a mile away there was a majority white, very affluent school whose kids were now, some of them being rezoned to my daughter's school. And the thing I kept hearing from those white parents was, this school is our community, and it has kids from our community. We were a mile away. Some of those parents actually lived across the street from my daughter's school, but that wasn't their community. So we need to think about, what do we mean by a community, and what do we owe to each other? And when we talk about Black children, do we really think about them as American children and our children, and deserving of the same things that we fight for our own kids? Because one of the things I get all the time from well-meaning parents is they'll say, I want to do the right thing, but I don't want to sacrifice my child. And my question is, whose children are we willing to sacrifice? These children, are we willing to sacrifice them? Maria, who was in Michael Brown School District, who, because of a quirky law in Missouri that no one really knew about, got the opportunity to go to desegregated schools, and a state that didn't care that her school district was worse, the worst district in the state. Suddenly people, legislators came together to act when she got access to those schools, and they wanted to force kids like her back to their segregated district. That was the only time legislatures felt like they should deal with the issue. Should we sacrifice her? Delisha, who I wrote about in 2014, who spent 13 years in all Black, all poor schools in a school system that had once been desegregated by court order, who was a top student in her class and couldn't score higher than a 16 on her ACT, who took every honors level course she could at her class, at her school, and still didn't know most of the things that the kids across town knew when she had to take her tests, who thought that college would be the very first time she had the opportunity to attend school with kids who looked different from her, but only got one college acceptance letter, and that was to a historically Black college in Birmingham. So whose kids are we willing to sacrifice when we're talking about we don't want to sacrifice our own children? As some of you may know, I love this picture, by the way. Last week, I was named a MacArthur Fellow. Thank you. I didn't say that for applause. Hold on. I'm just a girl from a working class family in Waterloo, Iowa. My father was born on a sharecropping farm in Mississippi in 1946, where they started making you go into the fields to bring water to the people picking cotton at the age of 3. He had no legal rights in Mississippi as a Black man at that time. And his mother gathered him and her 2 siblings and his 2 siblings on a train with nothing but a suitcase and a bag of cold chicken, and she got on the train and she came up north. And she came up north hoping that she would be able to find a better life for her own kids, because she was determined that they were not going to pick cotton. The problem was she came to the north and found that racism was not a Southern thing. And she had to get the same type of job that Black women like her had to get in the South, which was cleaning white people's houses. But here I am. And it's an amazing journey. And when I think about it, I went to public schools, but I went to schools that had to be desegregated. I was part of a busing program, and I started getting bused from the age of 2nd grade all the way to 12th grade. I rode the bus 2 hours a day, every day, just to get a quality education, when I should have been able to get that education in my own neighborhood. Had I not been part of that desegregation program, I don't know that I would be here. standing before you today. Because believe me, I'm not exceptional. There are millions of children just like me who could go just as far or further than me if we gave them a chance. And instead, we're stifling their ambition. We're telling them at a young age that they're not worthy. And then we blame them when they believe it. So I would hope that you would look at me, that you would hear what I say today and say, education was transformative for me. That in one generation we could go from sharecroppers to me being named a MacArthur Genius and working for the New York Times shows you the power of education. But it shouldn't be so tenuous. And for so many of our kids, that's exactly what it is. So I'm gonna leave with a thought that I already said once, because I hope that if you don't think about anything else that I said today, when you go back to your communities, that you understand that the fight for public schools must be a fight for integration, period. Thank you. Thank you.
Nicole has agreed to take a few questions. So if you have a question, please hold your hand and speak in a teacher voice.
How do you do it if the neighborhoods are so segregated and are? Do you go back to houses where the kids are on the bus for 2 hours a day? Or do you get involved with housing policy and try to desegregate the neighborhood?
So it's both and, right? One, I've also spent a lot of time working on school segregation, housing segregation. And the truth is, we don't enforce the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act, of all the great civil rights legislation, has been the least successful because housing is the most personal and intimate of the civil rights laws. So absolutely, you have to deal with housing. Oh, yes. Yes, so the question was, with so much residential segregation, how do we integrate schools? Do we implement busing again, or how do we do it? And so my answer is one, we absolutely have to enforce fair housing law. We have to build housing that is integrated. But to be truthful, that's not the only problem. So one thing we should be clear on is the majority of American children have ridden buses for a long time. And the problem only became, and most American children were never bused for integration, but the problem with busing only became an issue when kids were bused for integration. We don't care. I tell you, I live in New York City. New York City from 6th to 12th grade is district-wide choice. And white parents will put their kids on the train or a bus for an hour to get to the school that they want. So busing is a convenient red herring, but the facts actually don't bear it out. Most kids ride buses every day right now, and we don't have a problem with it. And in fact, for most of the history of busing, kids were bused for segregation and not integration. They were bused past their neighborhood schools in order to maintain integration, and we also didn't have a problem with that. So I think in New York City, we are a very segregated city. My daughter's school was all black in a white neighborhood. So what we find is that when you have white neighborhoods with white schools, parents want neighborhood schools. When you have white neighborhoods with black or brown schools, parents want choice. So the fundamental issue we have to address is racism, not the mode of integration. And that's just the truth. The question is, do we really think black and brown kids are just as deserving as kids of a quality education? And if that's the case, then we will do what needs to be done. Because I'll tell you for me, yes, I would have preferred to go to my neighborhood school. But parents will do anything that they have to do to get their kids an education. And if that means we implement busing, then so be it. Because kids are riding buses anyway. So I think we can come up with 1,000 excuses why we won't do it. almost all of them political. Almost none of them because it's not the right thing to do and not the best thing to do. Did everybody hear that, or should I repeat? Okay. She wanted to know are there any positive examples of communities who are working on the issue? So there's no, okay, I'm not a optimistic person. What I say, there are no places that are doing right by black children, I don't think. I don't think that there are any places that are doing what they should be, but there are certainly places that are working on it and that are trying, and it is important to hold up those examples. Otherwise, we can all throw our hands up and say we're not charged to do anything because nothing can be done. So some of the places that have been working on it the longest, Wake County, North Carolina, which has been held up as an example for a long time. They've had a Magna N busing program. They've managed to, until recently, once they lifted the charter school cap in North Carolina, you're starting to see flourishing of white charter schools, which are actually really starting to have a destabilizing effect on Wake County's desegregation program. But this was a community that was able to voluntarily, they were not placed under a school desegregation order. The business community, as well as white progressives in the town and the black community, decided that this was the right thing to do, and they did it. And so as other school districts saw white people fleeing the districts, Raleigh was able to hold on to its white students. And businesses, I mean, this is the thing, desegregation and integration actually makes sense. It's very hard to attract businesses to a school district that is so unequal. It drives housing segregation because, as you all know, people buy into certain neighborhoods to get into certain schools. What Wake County, through its busing program, did is it unlinked those two things, because you could buy into this neighborhood, but it didn't mean your kid was going to go to school in that neighborhood, and it actually freed people to move all across. Jefferson County in Kentucky, which I call like the badass school district, because even after the Supreme Court struck down their desegregation plan, they refused to stop. That's amazing, right? So there are some places, but there aren't a lot, and it takes a lot of work. I mean, in Wake County, they're having to rezone children every couple of years, and it's not easy. But I think when you have a community that believes that this is a value, that educating all children is a value, then you're willing to do certain things. When you have a community that only thinks, what are you doing for my child? Then you're unwilling to do a lot of things. But there are certainly some examples. And you should look, the Century Foundation put a report out, I think earlier this year or late last year, about all of the different communities who are doing some sort of desegregation plan, and it would be a good place to get some resources.
One more question.
I'll try to keep my answers shorter, sorry.
Diane, Carol, could this be the theme of next year's conference?
She wanted to know if this could be the theme of next year's conference.
Of course.